That is who you are. That is who you
Hey, I'm glad you joined us. All month long, we've been talking about biblical hope. And we defined it as the believer's confident expectation that God will make things right. And that is such a fantastic thought. We're certain of it. We're certain that God is aware of us and that God is going to work things together for our good, but using His methods in His timing. And we're certain of this because our hope is welded to our faith. As it says in Hebrews chapter 11, faith is being sure of what we hope for and being certain of what we do not see. Now, our hope doesn't minimize the tough situation that some of us are in. It just magnifies God on our screen, where we honestly acknowledge bad circumstances for exactly what they are. We don't sugarcoat our situation in order to cheer ourselves up. Instead, we face the storm head on, anchored to something more reliable than our feelings. As the prophet Jeremiah wrote in Lamentations 3, when I remember God, that's when I have hope. Because God's love for me and God's faithfulness to me never fail. My provisions are refreshed every morning. So our hope is anchored not in waiting for life to get better because we know it might get worse. Our hope is in God Himself. Because biblical hope is more than saying that things are better than they really are. It is trusting that God is as good as He says He is. Now, today we're studying the life and times of a resilient Old Testament hero, a young man who suffered a series of unfair circumstances over a period of 13 years. Yet he came through it all with an unbelievable job, a spotless reputation, and an amazing life purpose. He ultimately rescued a large nation and a tiny one from starvation. The process itself developed in him some unshakable morals and an elastic faith, taking him from immaturity to manhood. Our hero's name is Joseph, a 17-year-old whose story is found in the book of Genesis, and it is epic. Knocked down by trials that could have buried him in despair, he leaned into God's help and then consistently adapted as the plan continually changed. Open your Bibles with me to the book of Genesis, chapter 37, and meet Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob, also known as Israel. Now, Israel is the son of Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah. This Genesis family is a family that you need to read about. Verse 8 tells us how much his brothers hated him. Then in verse 17, Dad sent Joe to check on his brothers, and from that day when they saw him coming, they plotted to kill him. And they would have if their brother Reuben hadn't intervened. Look at verse 21. When Reuben heard of their plan to kill him, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness. Don't lay a hand on him." So when Joseph came, his brothers stripped him of his robe and they threw him into the cistern. And verse 25 tells us, as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said, "Hey, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Let's sell him instead. Let's not lay hands on him. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood." So they agreed. When the Midianite merchants pulled up, they sold Joseph for 20 shekels of silver. Well, His life changes from here on with this terrible thing done to him by his own family. As a teenager, he is betrayed by brothers he will not see again until he is almost 40 years old. I was thinking about some of you. I've heard some of your stories. Joseph is like some of you who have endured terrible abuse and neglect from your own flesh and blood. You of all people would know, how in the world is Joseph ever going to recover from that day in that pit, listening to his brothers debate whether to kill him or to sell him? Somehow, this abuse, this trauma did not destroy him or define him. And that's amazing. Especially when we read forward and we see that when they do meet again, a lifetime later, when he has the power to pay them back in spades, he simply forgives. All right, let's pick up the story in chapter 39, verse 1, where Joseph, who had been taken down to Egypt, Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. So Joseph ends up, he's a slave, but he's got a really great home to be in. It's going to be a very wealthy home. Potiphar is the captain of the palace guard. It says, verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. All right, let's stop there because I think there's a principle or two in play that could help us navigate life in 2020. First of all, I think of his age. He is 17 years old. Notice how this teenager leans into his new normal, basically letting go of plan A. He shows tremendous flexibility as he goes from being dad's favorite at home to becoming Potiphar's slave in Egypt. Now, how is he able to do that? Well, as we watch what he says, what he does, what he doesn't do here and even later, it shows that he didn't see this man Potiphar or this situation as mastering him. Joe only served God. And God was in control in Egypt as much as he was in Canaan. Joseph saw God as his real master, not Potiphar. And if God was allowing this to happen, if God could rescue him but didn't, then God must be working a plan. Knowing that, Joseph leaned into a plan that he did not understand, learning the Egyptian language and teaching himself how to run a large, wealthy, urban household. Abused by his family, working for an Egyptian owner, but assuming that God can bless him in any situation. It's the assumption that if God is allowing it, he will help me navigate it. Notice also how Joe gave Potiphar his best, even though he was stuck doing what he would not have ever chosen. Joseph was well-built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Oh, man. Teenager, far from home. But he refused. "Ma'am, with me in charge, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" No, she spoke to Joseph day after day. He refused to go to bed with her or even be near her. Well, the story goes on. It's terrible. Day after day, she comes after him. And one day she gets a hold of him and corners him and has him, and he just basically slips out of his coat and jams. And she's had enough. She screams. She calls people in, claims that he tried to rape her, shows them his garment. And then her husband comes home, and she says in verse 17, that Hebrew slave you brought to us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When Potiphar heard the story, his wife told him, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he believed her. He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Well, that's great. You do the right thing, the honorable thing, the ethical, moral thing, and this is what you get. Life would actually have been easier for this handsome young man if he had just given in to his boss's wife. But he just couldn't. His moral compass worked just as well when he was far from home, even if doing the right thing bore unfair and harsh consequences. Doing the right thing often means doing the harder thing. Read on. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. God showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And now we see the pattern emerge, one that stays with him through his entire life as he earns the favor and trust of those in authority over him. Whether he's in a mansion or a prison, whether it's Potiphar or the prison warden, anyone observing him easily sees that God's blessing is on him. Soon he's managing the prison with the same efficiency as he ran Potiphar's household. And did you notice the repeated phrase emerging in this story? We read it 4 times in chapter 39. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. The Lord was with him. God's abiding presence went with Joe wherever he was. It was the one constant in his life as circumstances continued to drastically change, and God was with Joe as much when Daddy was pampering him as he was when his brothers were counting their silver and seeing him disappear into the horizon. God was with him as much when he was respected by his wealthy Egyptian owner as when that same man had him arrested and punished without a trial. The only non-variable in Joseph's crazy life was God's abiding presence. Say those words with me. God's abiding presence. Friend, listen to me. God is with you in the same way. Circumstances change, but God is there for you to recognize. God is there for you to access his presence, his power, and his plan. God is with you to encourage you, advise you, to give you wisdom, patience, and perseverance. You are not on your own. Remind yourself of this simple truth. Be still several times each day in order to recognize that God is right there where you are. Maybe you want to write this phrase, God is with me, on a card and carry it around for a while. Back to Joseph in prison, running the prison. Read in chapter 40, verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. So he throws them into jail, and Joseph is assigned to look over them. So after a while, each of them had a dream. And back then, it was really thought that God spoke through dreams. And he actually did. So Joseph sees them the next morning, and he sees that they're kind of confused and talking about their dream. And he asks them, what's up with you guys? And they said, well, we both had dreams, but there's nobody here in the prison to interpret the dream. Then Joseph says to them, God can do it. Tell me your dream. So the cupbearer and the baker, who believed their dreams meant something, now are told by Joseph that he is going to interpret their dreams. Dreams are God's business, he says. Just tell me what they are, and I'll ask God for the interpretation. Now, this is crazy, because to our knowledge, this young man has never interpreted anyone's dreams. But that doesn't stop him, and here's why. This kid believes that God can miraculously, instantly give him a completely new skill set. Because of his faith in God, Joe views himself with unlimited potential. I work for God, he says, so he'll tell me what your dreams mean. Amazing also that this guy whose own dreams have been shattered over and again is willing to help them live out their dreams. Like Joe made Potiphar's life better, and then the prison warden's life better, now he helps his cellmates. You know, another thought for us to ponder is how we also can serve others where our dreams are still pending. We don't have to wait for our life to come together until we reach out and help others with theirs. So, the cupbearer goes first, and his dream is bizarre. You'll have to read it. But then God does give Joseph the accurate interpretation that the baker is about to be released and return to his old job. No, that would be the cupbearer is about to be released. Now, the baker is encouraged by the news of the cupbearer, so he quickly tells Joseph his dream. But the interpretation is horrifying and unfortunately accurate. In 3 days, Joseph tells him, you will be executed. Bad news for the baker, good news for the cupbearer. But what about Joseph? Look at verse 20. Well, the third day was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hands. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to him in the interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. I envision 28-year-old Joe going back to his cell on Pharaoh's birthday. I see him packing his meager belongings and telling the warden goodbye and sitting on the edge of his bunk. And then a day passes, and then 2 days, and then a month, and then 2 years. 24 months of waiting in prison. That's 104 weeks, 730 days of being forgotten. I think I would have gotten bitter and given up at this point. I would have thought God had abandoned me. I do wonder if this was the most difficult season for Joseph. Forgotten by the cupbearer, a man he had helped who had the power to help him. So this week, as I prepared to share this with you, I did see something new. I noticed this repeated phrase in the Joseph story. Sometime after this, it says. Another place it says, sometime later. And as I sat with this repeated phrase, I was reminded that for believers anyway, there is always later. I mean, that's what biblical hope is about, that later will be better. The very foundation of our belief is the ability to trust the God of now to also be the God of later. We don't know when and we don't know how. It may be much later, like in heaven. Yet still we know that someday life will be much better for those who love the Lord. And at this point, hope was all Joseph had. These prison years were long and hard, especially the last two. But hope was enough, and then it happened. One night, Pharaoh had a disturbing dream. Well, two dreams, actually. Let's look at chapter 41, verse 8. In the morning, Pharaoh's mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. He told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Oh my, I can't believe this. There's a guy in your jail that can interpret your dreams. I was supposed to tell you about him. I totally forgot. I'm such an idiot." So, verse 14, Pharaoh sends for Joseph. He's quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh, who said to Joseph, "I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I have heard that you have this tremendous talent of dream interpretation, to which Joseph responded, "No, I don't. I cannot do it. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." What a mature answer. I mean, did you see how when Pharaoh gives Joe a chance to puff his resume and brag on himself about his amazing ability, his response is, "I have no ability at all or skill independent of what God will provide." But then he also says, God's going to provide. This beautiful 17-year-old who was also immature and boastful has now become an amazing, spiritually strong and humble 30-year-old man. Pharaoh tells him his dreams, and Joe interprets them. Look at verse 29. Here's what's going to happen, Pharaoh. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but then they will be followed by 7 years of terrible famine. You need to prepare for this. And then Joseph, he's pretty bold here. He gives Pharaoh some unsolicited advice. You don't stand in the king's courtyard having just come out of prison and start giving him advice. But this is the confidence that he has with the advice. He says in verse 33, "Here's what you need to do, Pharaoh. Find a discerning and wise man and put him in charge. Appoint commissioners and collect food and store it and let's feed the people, but let's help them understand that the 7 years of abundance is going to be followed by 7 years of famine." Verse 37, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and all his officials. And Pharaoh asked everybody, "Hey, can we find anybody like this guy right here? He's got the Spirit of God." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning as wise as you, and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all the people are submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And you're going to want to read on because the story just gets amazing from here. We have just seen the last of Joe's low moments, and from the rest of life, God really uses this guy to save this nation and also to save his own family. So, before we go though, let's apply what we just read to our lives. First, let's talk about transitions. Imagine all the crazy transitions in Joseph's life. He goes from being his father's favorite to being sold into slavery. That 750-mile walk across the hot desert would have been an unforgettable nightmare. Then in Egypt, he's purchased by an Egyptian who likes him, who appreciates his talent, who honors his God. But then after Joe's life is really good, it gets really terrible as the boss's wife doesn't get what she wants. On that day, he starts what would have been at least 10 years in prison, until he finds himself standing before Pharaoh with his eyes still adjusting to the light, and then advising Pharaoh with a really good plan. The drastic transitions in his life had to be disoriented, but we don't see that. He doesn't seem to miss a beat, and that also is incredible. Strong scientific data confirms how transitions, whether they're good or bad, are really stressful. Yet Joseph handles whatever is thrown at him with grace and dignity and humility. And Pharaoh's response to an encounter with Joe is the same as Potiphar's response, the same as the prison warden's response. These Egyptians have never heard of Joseph or his God, but they are obviously and very quickly impressed with this young man. My hope is that we could all represent God this well with those we meet who don't know him, that they would see the real benefits of serving our God out of our lives, and that they would know we are serving God by how often we talk about him. Whenever Joe had the opportunity, he talked about his God, and he did it in such a winsome way. He mentions God 4 times in his conversations with Pharaoh. I think that's pretty cool. Finally, at age 30, life comes around for him. He's on top of the world, ready to follow God's plan, to save Egypt and to save his family, the 70 members of the clan known as Israel. As author Gretchen Fleming writes, Joseph did not waste his time in the wasteland. When his brothers sold him, he survived. When Potiphar owned him, he excelled. When the boss's wife tempted him, he resisted. When he was thrown into prison, he persevered. When it seemed like his last friend had forgotten him, still he believed. He never wavered. He simply refused to give up, believing that God was aware and working a plan. Joseph became resilient. Ultimately, God turned evil to good, but Joe had to wait for it. 13 years is a long time to wait for life to get better. It wasn't easy. And the scripture challenges us over and over to wait, but it never promises that waiting will be easy. Let me ask you, what are you waiting for God to do? Could you wait a little longer? You know, God is found in the waiting. Strength is gathered in the waiting. You may surprise yourself with your faith and just how long you can endure a trial. Hang in there, friend. Wait for it. While you wait, work on your perspective, how you see yourself in your present realities. Joseph refused to see himself as powerless. Instead, he saw himself as God's man placed in unpleasant circumstances. He was always looking for the reason why God had allowed him to be where he was. Believers like Joseph never give up until they find their purpose in each and every environment. They're resilient.